been reviewing your scapula debrief. I'll link it in the show notes, which will be found on zachcouples.com/shoulder-flexion. But I've been checking out your scapula debrief, and the motion's getting me a little hung up. I've always thought that shoulder flexion, upward rotation, external rotation, and posterior tilt were together. But you're saying that the scaps upwardly rotate, internally rotate, and anteriorly tilt. What's the reasoning behind this? Or is there something I'm missing in the research? People always drove into my brain upward rotation and posterior tilt help clear the space for shoulder flexion. Any relationships or misunderstanding there? I apologize if there was some confusion regarding this, but sports rehab expert, you're right. Upward rotation, external rotation, and posteriorly tilt are together as I go overhead. And the issue, though, is the plane that the scapula sits in changes as you complete full shoulder flexion. So let's unpack that. Let's go through the entire sequence of scapulohumeral rhythm. We're going to break this down into 3 different segments. 0 to 60, shoulder flexion, 60 to 120, 120 to 180-ish, depending on who you are. That's how shoulder flexion is broken down. It's generally, if you look at some of the research, especially I would check out the Ludwig article that I cite the snot out of, the motion of, I think it's like multiplanar humeral elevation. It'll be in the show notes, party people. But definitely check that out because that will give you an outline of what's going on with that. But 0 to 60, resting position of the scapula, at least according to this article, is about 41 degrees of internal rotation, meaning that the medial border is going to be a little bit off of the rib cage, about 5 degrees of upward rotation. I believe it's like 15 or 16 degrees of anterior tilt. That's the scapular position at rest. You chilling like you're Bob Dylan. Now, in the first 60 degrees of shoulder flexion, I get mostly humeral motion, and there's a slight external rotation bias about it. The scapula does not need to move much at all. So in that case, the scapula is internally rotated still. And that's magnified by the increase in external rotation at the humerus. Humeral external rotation means there's going to be scapular internal rotation. And the reason being is because if you look at the anatomy of the rotator cuff muscles, the external rotators predominantly, so let's say I contract those muscles and I keep the humerus fixed. Because they attach close to the medial border of the scapula, they're actually going to pull the scapula away from the medial border, aka internal rotation. I'll have a picture of the rotator cuff muscles in the show notes so you can kind of see that line of pull that I'm talking about and how internal rotation would be the action that's happening. When we go from 60 to 120, things get a little crazy. We start to get the scapula picking up the slack and clearing space like you've talked about. You sports rehab expert, you. So as you start to go into 60 to 120 degrees of shoulder flexion, the scapula is going to stay congruent up against the rib cage. So I increase or I reduce the space between the scapula and the thorax. In order for that to happen, the scapula has to externally rotate and upwardly rotate. This is going to lead to a relative internal rotation at the humerus for the same reasons that we talked about with the posterior cuff muscles. Subscapularis, which is the primary internal rotator locally at the humerus, also creates scapular external rotation because of the line of pull. If I fix the humerus and I contract the scap, boom, it's going to fall into external rotation. So you do get this combined external rotation and upward rotation. And that's from 60 to about 120 degrees of shoulder flexion. If we look at 120 and beyond, with that range of motion, the scapula is still upwardly rotating and externally rotating. That's still there. But here's what changes that allows you to get some posterior expansion, i.e., which I need some degree of internal rotation to make that happen. The scapula continues to upwardly rotate in ER, but the interesting thing is it realigns back into the scapular plane. The scapular plane is about 45 degrees forward from abduction, so it's kind of in the middle between pure sagittal flexion and pure abduction, somewhere in the middle there. So when it aligns in that plane, even though the scapula is externally rotating, from a positional standpoint, that is more of a position of internal rotation of the scapula. So there's going to be some opening of the posterior thorax in that regard. Couple that with the maximal increase in upward rotation. Your downward rotators, namely in the posterior thorax, the rhomboids are going to be more eccentrically oriented, and that's going to allow for some degree of posterior expansion back there. Even though I'm still driving external rotation because of the location of the scapula, you still get some posterior expansion. So I don't want to have any confusion in that regard that there's internal rotation happening with upward rotation. Upward rotation and ER are combined. What changes, and that can influence where you're getting expansion in the thorax, is the location of the scapula. As you approach higher ranges of shoulder flexion, there's going to be more external rotation of the scapula, but I'm aligned in the scapular plane. That allows for some posterior expansion. The other thing to consider as well is when I go from 120 to 180, that's when the humerus begins to maximally externally rotate. You get roughly, depending on the person, about 60 degrees of external rotation there. If I'm externally rotating the humerus, that will drive relative internal rotation at the scapula. So the combination of those things in those upper ranges, scapula aligning in the scapular plane, increasing humeral ER, that will allow some degree of posterior expansion because there are some influences that are driving some semblance of internal rotation at the scapula. I want us to be careful because there is not this on-off switch between ER and IR. These are all relative motions that are happening, and you just have a few influences in the higher ranges of shoulder flexion that allow some degree of posterior expansion because scapular IR to some degree is needed in that regard. So I hope that answers your question, sports rehab expert. It's not as cut and dry as this on and off switch, but because of the scapular plane alignment and the humeral external rotation, even though ER of the scapula is still being driven, it does allow for some expansion posteriorly. It's all about location, location, location. Great question.